Imagine a place, deep in the heart of Bavaria, Germany, far from bustling cities, nestled among rolling hills and dense forests. This was Hinterkaifeck, not a village, not even a hamlet, just a solitary farm, a cluster of buildings, a barn, a small house. Surrounded by fields, by trees, by absolute silence. It was 1922. The world was still reeling from the Great War. But here at Hinterkaifeck life went on. Or so it seemed. The farm was home to the Gruber family. Andreas Gruber, the stern patriarch, and his wife Cäzilia. Their widowed daughter, Viktoria Gabriel, lived with them, along with her two young children, Cäzilia, just 7 years old, and little Josef, barely 2. A new maid, Maria Baumgartner, had just arrived days before. 6 souls, living their lives, day in and day out, on this remote patch of land. The Grubers were not well liked in the nearby village of Wanden. They kept to themselves. Andreas Gruber was known for his temper, his strict ways. Whispers and dark rumors clung to the family like Bavarian fog, secrets. But even with their reputation, no one expected what was to come. No one could have imagined the horror that would unfold, leaving a scar on Germany's history, a mystery that chills to this day. Life at Hinterkaifeck was routine. The clatter of chores, the lowing of cattle, the distant ring of an axe, the smoke rising from the chimney, a steady signal of life. But then, something changed. Slowly, insidiously. It began on Friday, March 31st, 1922. That was the last day anyone saw the Grubers alive, the last day their chimney smoked, the last day their presence was felt beyond their isolated farm. The first hint of trouble was subtle, too subtle for some. The mailman, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who often did odd jobs for the Grubers, arrived at the farm that Saturday, April 1st. He noticed something strange. Friday's mail was still in the mailbox, untouched. He waited. No one appeared. He called out. Silence. He assumed they were busy. Perhaps in town. He left the mail and went on his way. But the silence continued. Saturday turned into Sunday. Sunday into Monday. The smoke never reappeared. The animals in the barn were not tended. The children did not show up for school in Wangen. This was unlike them. Andreas Gruber was a man of routine, a man who expected things to be done. His grandchildren were never late for school. A growing unease settled over the village. A cold creeping feeling. People talked, whispered. Have you seen the Grubers? No, not a keep. The chimney's cold. It wasn't just a misdelivery anymore. It was a pattern. A disturbing lack of pattern. By Tuesday, April 4th, the worry was too much to ignore. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, with 2 other villagers, Michael Pohl and Jakob Sigel, decided to investigate. They walked the familiar path to Hinterkaifeck. The air hung heavy, an unnatural quiet. No barking dogs, no sounds of farm life, just the wind through the trees. A silence too loud. They approached the farmyard. The barn doors were open. A chilling sight. The cows inside were lowing softly, their udders full, clearly distressed, untended. The men called out, Gruber, Andreas, anyone home? Their voices echoed in the stillness. No answer, only the anxious moans of the cattle. A sense of dread washed over them. They entered the barn. The air was thick, heavy. A smell, something metallic, something sickly sweet. They searched. Their hearts pounded, and then they saw it. In the barn, beneath the hay, a gruesome tableau. 4 bodies, piled on top of each other. Andreas Gruber, his wife Cäzilia, their daughter Viktoria Gabriel, and little Cäzilia, the 7-year-old granddaughter. All brutally murdered, their heads crushed, their faces unrecognizable. The weapon, they would later discover, was a mattock. A heavy pickaxe, a tool of the farm, turned into an instrument of unimaginable horror. The men stumbled out of the barn, shocked, sickened. But the horror wasn't over. Not yet. They had to check the house. Every instinct screamed at them to flee. But they had to know. They pushed open the door to the farmhouse. The silence inside was even deeper, more profound. A silence that spoke of death. They moved from room to room, the kitchen, the living room, and then the bedrooms. They found the 5th victim, in her bed. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner. She had only been there for a few days. She too had been brutally murdered, her head crushed. And then the sixth, little Joseph, the 2-year-old grandson, found in his cradle. His tiny skull shattered. 6 lives extinguished. 6 souls ripped from their bodies in the most brutal way. The village was plunged into shock. The police were called. Detectives arrived from Munich. The isolated farm became a crime scene, a place of unspeakable tragedy. But as the investigators began their work, they uncovered something even more disturbing. Something that twisted the knife of horror even deeper. The killer hadn't just murdered the family and left. No. The killer had stayed. But even for the days after the murders, life had continued at Hinterkaifeck. The animals had been fed. The cows had been milked. Meals had been eaten in the kitchen. The perpetrator or perpetrators had lived among the dead. They had slept in the beds, they had brewed coffee, they had sat at the family's table. The kitchen fireplace, cold when the bodies were discovered, had been warmed just days before. Food had been prepared. Chickens had been let out. The dog, usually barking at strangers, was gone, but its tracks were found in the snow, leading away from the farm. Someone had been there. Someone had been living in the house, surrounded by the bodies of their victims. The silence of the grave was pierced by the phantom sounds of a killer's daily routine. What kind of person could do that? What kind of monster? This wasn't just a massacre. It was an invasion, a desecration. The killer hadn't fled in panic. They had taken their time. They had lingered. Even mark aside, they had eaten the Gruber's food. They had slept in the Gruber's beds. They had watched the farm. The motive remained a mystery. Robbery was quickly ruled out. Money and valuables were found untouched in the house. Was it revenge? A personal vendetta? But against whom, and why such an extreme, drawn-out act of terror? The farm, once a symbol of Bavarian resilience, became a monument to fear, a place where the dead lay undiscovered for days while their killer walked among them. The silence of Hinterkaifeck, once just the quiet of the countryside, now held a terrifying secret. It wasn't just the silence of death. It was the silence of a killer, waiting, watching, living among the horror they had created. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished, leaving no trace, no witness, only the 6 brutally murdered bodies and a chilling question: what was the killer doing on that farm for all those days? And where did they go? The silence of Hinterkaifeck had many layers, and the deepest, most terrifying layer was still waiting to be uncovered. The snow fell silently that day. A fresh, thick blanket covered the Bavarian landscape, turning the world outside the remote Hinterkaifeck farm into a hushed, pristine canvas. It was March 29, 1922. A seemingly ordinary Wednesday, but beneath that innocent white shroud, a chilling secret lay hidden, waiting to be discovered. And for the Gruber family, who lived on that isolated farmstead, the snow brought with it an omen, a warning they wouldn't understand until it was far too late. Andreas Gruber, the stern patriarch of Hinterkaifeck, stepped out into the crisp morning air. He was a man of the land, used to reading its signs. But what he saw etched in the freshly fallen snow that morning defied all logic. Footprints, clear, deep impressions, leading from the dense, dark woods that bordered his property. They wound through the drifts, past the barns, and stopped right at the farmhouse door. Unmistakable. Someone had walked right up to their home. But here's where the story takes its first chilling twist. There were no footprints leading none, 0. It was as if a phantom visitor had simply materialized at their doorstep, then vanished into thin air. Andreas searched, his brow furrowed with a mixture of confusion and growing unease. He walked the perimeter, scanned the tree line, but found nothing. Only those one-way tracks, a silent accusation in the snow. This wasn't the first strange occurrence at Hinterkaifeck. Oh no. For months, an unsettling atmosphere had been creeping over the farm, tightening its grip on the Gruber family like an unseen hand. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Small things, annoying things, things that could be explained away, at first. Take the house keys, for example. The heavy iron keys, usually hanging securely by the kitchen door, would vanish. Not just misplaced. Gone. The family would search, growing increasingly frustrated, only for them to mysteriously reappear days later, sometimes in places nobody could explain. On a windowsill, tucked under a tea towel, as if someone was playing a cruel, silent game. Who would do such a thing? And why? Then came the noises. Creaks and thumps from the attic. At night, when everyone was supposed to be asleep, the Grubers would lie in their beds, listening to the unsettling sounds above them. Heavy footsteps, the rustle of movement. Were they rats? Andreas, a practical man, swore it was nothing more. He'd climb up, lantern in hand, searching every dusty corner, but found nothing. No signs of vermin, no broken boards, just the same empty, cold space. Yet the noises persisted. A phantom guest, living just above their heads, unseen, unheard by anyone but the family. The bizarre events escalated. A new newspaper appeared on the kitchen table one morning. The family hadn't bought it. Nobody had ordered it. Andreas, always careful with money, would never have spent on such a luxury. Yet there it was, freshly printed. Someone had brought it into their home, someone who shouldn't have been there. The previous maid, Maria Baumgartner, had fled the farm in terror just 6 months earlier. She'd worked for the Grubers for years, a quiet, dependable woman. But something had broken her. She refused to stay, abandoning her wages, claiming the farm was haunted. She spoke of shadows, of whispers, of an overwhelming sense of dread that clung to the very air of Hinterkaifeck. She packed her bags, left without a backward glance, and never returned. Was it just superstition? Or had Maria sensed something far more sinister than ghosts? The family tried to make sense of it all. Andreas, his wife Cäzilia, their widowed daughter Viktoria Gabriel, and her 2 young children Cäzilia and Josef. They talked about it, argued about it, tried to rationalize it away. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was their imaginations. Maybe a neighbor was playing a cruel prank. But deep down, a cold dread began to settle in their hearts. They were not alone. Someone was in their house. Someone was watching them. Was the killer already there, living among them, hiding in plain sight or in the shadows, just beyond their vision? The footprints in the snow, the disappearing keys, the attic noises, the mysterious newspaper, they all painted a terrifying picture, a picture of an intruder, a silent observer, patiently waiting. Not a ghost, but a flesh and blood presence, a predator stalking its prey within the very walls of their home. The Grubers were living on borrowed time. They had unknowingly welcomed an unwelcome guest, an invisible threat that moved through their lives, unseen, unheard, a master of stealth. The peaceful, isolated farm was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a cage, and the bars were closing in. They didn't know it, but the stage was set. The final act of this macabre play was about to begin. The killer, if indeed he was already there, had finished his ominous prelude. He had observed, he had planned, and soon he would strike. The quiet farm of Hinterkaifeck was about to become the scene of one of Germany's most brutal and baffling unsolved crimes. But first, the new maid was about to arrive, and with her the final pieces of this chilling puzzle would fall into place. Imagine a cold, dark night in Bavaria, March 31st, 1922, a remote farm called Hinterkaifeck. The Gruber family, their young maid, and little Josef Gabriel, just 2 years old, are brutally murdered. 6 innocent lives extinguished in a single, terrifying spree. But here's where the story takes a turn so dark, so utterly chilling, it will haunt your thoughts long after you hear it. Because the killer didn't just strike and flee. No, they stayed. They became a ghost in the farmhouse, a phantom among the dead. The most horrifying detail of the Hinterkaifeck massacre isn't just the sheer brutality of the murders. It's what happened star after star. In Hinterkaifeck, Massacre followed before the bodies were finally discovered on April 4th. The killer, or killers, didn't just vanish into the night. They lived in that house, with the corpses, for days. Think about that. Picture it. 6 bodies, some still in their beds, others stacked in the barn. And somewhere, moving through the silent rooms, a living, breathing human being. A monster. The farm animals, oblivious to the horror, still needed tending. The cows in the barn, usually milked twice a day, were not forgotten. Someone walked past the still forms of Andreas and Cäzilia Gruber, past their daughter Viktoria and her own child Cäzilia, lying in a makeshift grave in the barn. Someone unlatched the stalls, someone fed the livestock, the cows were milked, their udders weren't bursting, a clear sign of recent care. The family dog, a loyal companion, was fed. The cat, too, was looked after. This wasn't a quick, panicked escape. This was a deliberate, methodical existence. The kidder ate. Imagine sitting at the kitchen table, perhaps still stained with the remnants of the family's last meal, and preparing your own. The pantry, stocked with food, was raided. Plates were used. Food was consumed. Police later found evidence of recent meals, of provisions taken from the cupboards. The killer wasn't starving. They were dining. They kept warm. The Bavarian nights in early April are still frigid. The farmhouse, even with the windows shut tight, would have been cold. But the stove in the kitchen was lit. Fires crackled. Smoke curled from the chimney, a silent signal to anyone passing by that life continued at Hinterkaifeck. Except it didn't. Not really, only a macabre parody of it. Who was this person? Who possessed such an unimaginable level of cold-blooded composure? To walk among the dead, to perform the mundane tasks of daily life, to eat, to sleep, to exist in the very space where they had just committed such unspeakable acts. What kind of mind could process such a reality? What kind of heart could beat so steadily through such a nightmare? The killer remained unseen, unheard, a phantom orchestrating a grotesque play. The isolated location of Hinterkaifeck, far from prying eyes and curious neighbors, made this horrific charade possible. No one visited the farm for days. No one noticed the silence, the lack of movement, the absence of the Grubers. The killer had time, all the time in the world. They moved through the house like a shadow. Perhaps they slept in one of the beds, the very bed of their victims. Perhaps they sat in Andreas Gruber's favorite chair, staring into the flickering firelight, contemplating their monstrous deeds. What thoughts ran through their mind? Was there remorse? Or was there a chilling satisfaction? We can only guess at the terrifying psychology of a person capable of such an act. The killer wasn't just a murderer. They were a squatter, a trespasser on the threshold between life and death. They transformed a family home into a tomb, and then, inexplicably, they made it their own for a brief, horrifying period. Every action, every fed animal, every lit fire, every eaten meal screams of a calculated, almost ritualistic defiance of discovery. Imagine the sheer audacity, the absolute lack of human empathy required to continue living a semblance of normal life, surrounded by the very people you just extinguished. This wasn't a crime of passion, quickly regretted. This was something far more deliberate, far more chillingly sustained. And then, as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. On April 4th, when neighbors finally grew concerned by the Gruber's absence and the uncollected mail, they made the gruesome discovery. The bodies were found. The silence of Hinterkaifeck was finally broken by screams of horror. But the killer was long gone, vanished, leaving behind only the unspeakable aftermath and the indelible question, why? The evidence of this unholy stay painted a picture of a killer who was not just an intruder, but a resident. A temporary, terrifying master of a house of horrors. This detail, more than any other, sets the Hinterkaifeck murders apart. It elevates the crime from a simple act of violence to a profound psychological terror. It leaves us wondering not just who committed these murders, but who could be such a person. A person who lived with the dead. But the killer's ghostly presence wasn't the only strange thing happening at Hinterkaifeck. Even before the murders, the farm had been a place of unsettling occurrences, strange noises, and an ever-present sense of dread. Hinterkaifeck. The name itself chills you to the bone. A quiet farm in rural Bavaria, forever stained by a massacre so brutal, so baffling, it birthed a legend, the curse of Hinterkaifeck. This isn't just another unsolved case. It's a wound in Germany's collective memory, a phantom limb that aches with unanswered questions. For over a century, the truth has refused to die, and the killer has refused to be found. The horror began on April 4, 1922, when neighbors stumbled upon a scene of unimaginable carnage. 6 souls, brutally murdered, their lives extinguished with a pickaxe. Farmer Andreas Gruber, his wife Cäzilia, their widowed daughter Viktoria Gabriel, and her 2 young children, Cäzilia and Josef. Even the maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had only arrived hours earlier, was not spared. But the tragedy didn't end with the murders. It was compounded by what followed: a crime scene handled with shocking incompetence, a lost opportunity to catch a killer. From the very beginning, the investigation was a disaster. The local police, inexperienced and overwhelmed, made critical errors. They delayed for hours, even days, before securing the scene. Villagers, curious onlookers, and even police officers trampled through the farm, contaminating crucial evidence. There was no understanding of modern forensics. Fingerprints were smudged. Footprints were obliterated. Potential clues vanished beneath the boots of the well-meaning but misguided. The bodies themselves were moved, disturbed, and later, during hasty autopsies, the victims' heads were severed for examination, only to be lost in the chaos. Imagine the horror. Not only murdered, but their remains treated with such disrespect. It was a botched job from start to finish, an open invitation for a killer to escape justice. What evidence remained was scarce, contradictory, or simply baffling. No clear signs of forced entry. Nothing of significant value seemed to be stolen, despite cash being found in the house. The murder weapon, a pickaxe, was eventually found in the barn, but its path to discovery was muddled. This wasn't a simple robbery. This was something far more sinister, far more personal. And perhaps the most chilling detail of all, someone had lived on the farm after the murders. The animals had been fed. Food had been eaten from the kitchen. The killer, it seemed, had stayed behind, a ghost among the dead, for days, perhaps even a week, before disappearing into the night. Who was this phantom killer, and what twisted motive kept them at the scene of their horrific crime? Over the decades, the case refused to die, instead spawning a parade of suspects, each theory more unsettling than the last. Was it robbery gone wrong, despite the lack of stolen goods? Police chased down countless tramps, vagrants, and local ne'er-do-wells, but every lead fizzled. Was it revenge? Andreas Gruber was known to be a difficult man, not well liked in the community. Did someone hold a grudge so deep, so violent, that they would extinguish an entire family, including 2 small children? Then there were the family secrets, whispered behind closed doors, hinting at a darker truth. Rumors of an incestuous relationship between Andreas and his daughter Viktoria, and that the youngest child, Josef, was the product of this forbidden union. Could a jilted lover, a jealous husband, or an outraged family member have sought bloody retribution? Viktoria's husband Karl Gabriel had died in the war, but persistent rumors suggested he might not have been dead at all, or that his comrades sought vengeance for some perceived slight. Even Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who discovered the bodies and was believed by some to be Joseph's true father, fell under suspicion. His behavior was peculiar, his story shifting. He was cleared, but the shadow of doubt lingered. Years turned into decades. The initial investigators passed away. New generations of police took up the mantle, reopening the case in 1952, 1968, and again in 1986. Each time they re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined the scant evidence, and unearthed new theories. The Gullert brothers, Adolf and Anton, local troublemakers with a history of violence, were heavily scrutinized. Adolf even confessed in 1951, only to recant later. Josef Bartel, a former farmhand, was another suspect, with a history of threatening the Grubers. Even students from the Munich Police Academy were assigned the case in 2007, using modern techniques to analyze the old files. But they too hit a wall. The passage of time, the destroyed evidence, the fading memories, it all conspired to protect the killer. Less than a year after the massacre, in 1923, the Hinterkaifeck farm was torn down. Brick by brick, stone by stone, the villagers dismantled the site of so much horror. It was an attempt to erase the evil, to remove the physical manifestation of the curse. They searched for clues during the demolition, hoping to find a hidden weapon or a forgotten piece of evidence, but found nothing. The land was eventually sold, a new farmhouse built, but the original site remained haunted, a silent testament to the unsolved crime. You can tear down the walls, but you can't erase a ghost. Why does this brutal, inexplicable crime continue to haunt Germany, leaving us with endless questions? Perhaps it's the sheer brutality, the cold-blooded murder of an entire family, including children. Perhaps it's the chilling detail of the killer living among the dead. Or perhaps it's the enduring injustice, the knowledge that a monster walked away, unpunished, and lived out their days in freedom. Hinterkaifeck isn't just a cold case, it's a mirror reflecting our deepest fears. The unknown, the inexplicable. the evil that can lurk unseen in the quietest corners of our world. Generations have lived and died. The witnesses are long gone. The physical evidence, if it ever truly existed, has vanished. But the questions remain, whispering through the Bavarian forests, echoing in the true crime forums. Who slaughtered the Grubers and Dullers, and why? Will the truth ever truly emerge from the shadows of Hinterkaifeck, or is this one curse that will never be broken? Subscribe to Study Z for more contents like these.